Thank you so much, Nirman, for that lovely introduction. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes, okay. So I'm going to focus my presentation and talk today on something that I know has already been touched on earlier in the conference, both by Mario Aguilas and also by the keynote speaker. And that topic is militarization. But I'm going to be focusing on it from a slightly different angle. So I'm going to be looking at what a question that has been on my mind for the last 2 years, having worked in Jaffna and traveled across the Northeast, which is what are the long-term impacts of militarization and securitization on Tamil national identity and Tamil political aspirations, particularly those that are centered on self-determination and nationhood. So before I get started, I just want to go through a couple terms that I'll be using and how I personally define them. So the first is what I mean by militarization. The definition that I prefer to use is that of academic Cynthia Unlow, who defines it as the step-by-step process by which something becomes controlled by, dependent on, or derives its value from the military. And I think, I won't go into too much detail about this because I know it's already been discussed. But in the 9 years since the war ended in Sri Lanka, I think rather than decrease the levels of militarization in the Northeast, what we've actually seen is an increase in the role of the military in civilian lives across the country, across the Northeast, but particularly in the Vanni region. And I think this is where it's important not to just look at militarization on a numerical level, because yes, the military has slightly decreased in size since the end of the war. I think at last count, we're looking at about 240,000 troops. But when we talk about militarization, it's not just about their physical presence, it's also the ways in which they're embedded in civilian lives, ranging from employment to education. So one example is with regards to the Civil Security Department, which employs over 3,500, mostly former LTT cadres and war-affected women in Kilinochchi and Mullaitivu alone. You also have education, right, where the military is involved in preschools, but also in sports ceremonies and award ceremonies. And so they've become a very critical part of everyday life across the Northeast. And the short-term impact of this has been really well documented, and I think it's already been discussed at this conference with regards to the ongoing human rights violations, the repression of economic growth, as well as some of the suppression of civic and political engagement. And these issues are all covered in reports we did last year, one between Adayalam and Pearl, and the other on the Civil Security Department by Adayalam. The other term that I'm going to refer to is securitization. So I think oftentimes we talk about militarization, but don't give enough attention to securitization. And securitization is the process by which the Tamil population is painted out to be an existential threat to the Sri Lankan state. So I think, this at times can be seen in the so-called regrouping of the LTT that the Sri Lankan government always cites around special days such as Mavidanal or May 18th, or even right before the local government elections. It can also be seen in the way that the diaspora is painted out to be this sort of extremist, war-hungry kind of beast. And I think Dr. Madhuraka Rasaratnam has written in her book, Tamils in the Nation, quote, "After the war, the diaspora has replaced the LTT as the malevolent new force of Tamil nationalism, threatening Sinhala Buddhist order and therefore terrorist by definition." And so I think what I think is important to premise my talk on then is that two processes, securitization and militarization, are mutually reinforcing processes. The Sri Lankan state points to the fact that the Tamil population is prone, in their view, is always prone to violence, is always prone to regrouping as a justification for the military's presence in the Northeast. And then because the military is so present in the Northeast, they create these scenarios in which it is easy to securitize the Tamil population, such as the Ava gang, which again, we've written about quite extensively in a brief that we published in November 2016 that talks about the fact that this so-called gang violence in Jaffna is very much linked to military intelligence and has to be deeply interrogated in terms of the motives and modus operandi of it. So now kind of coming back to the question that I'd like to focus on today. what is the impact, the long-term impact potentially of militarization and securitization on questions of self-determination and nationhood? A common refrain I've heard from individuals across the Northeast over the last 2 years goes something like, "We can't trust anyone in our village, Akka. I heard that that man, a neighbor, is an informant for the military, and apparently that woman, another neighbor, has been seen with intelligence at her house." And war-affected Tamil communities I've encountered between 2016 and 2018 across all 8 districts of the Northeast have issued these sort of complaints about their own communities. They all share this perception that there are these vast, deep intelligence networks comprising not just the obvious kind of external security forces, but also their own. So whether in places of open resistance, such as protests of families of the disappeared, or in people's own homes, Tamils in the Northeast just don't feel safe or beyond the reach of the Sri Lankan state's omnipresent ear. Following the war's conclusion, and so we have to ask ourselves, we have to, I think, look at, well, what are the reasons for this fear, and what is promoting this perception that within our communities, there can't be trust, there can't be cohesiveness. And I think to do that, you have to look at, well, how did the war conclude and what happened after the war ended? And following the war's conclusion, the entire Tamil community was subjected to the military's physical presence, but also, more importantly, the intelligence network. And so Ambika Satkunanathan writes that the impact of this was what she calls the mobilization of fear through the creation of a widespread belief of this sort of extensive surveillance mechanism throughout the North, which enabled the military to control the population even without the physical presence of a military in uniform there. And I think with regard to this, it's important to revisit something Gotabaya Rajapaksa said in 2013 in Sinhala during a rally in the South, which is that the end goal was to turn the Northeast into an open-air prison, which means that the military wouldn't have to be there, but that we would police ourselves. And it's not just about people who are affiliated to the LTT or definition really broadened in kind of the last phase of the conflict in the post-2009 era under the Rajapaksas to mean anything that challenged the state order. So whether that was human rights investigations, human rights activists, or whether it was political mobilization around Tamil national identity, I think that, you know, the understanding of what it was to be anti-Sri Lankan state was seen as extremely broad. And as many of us noted in the years following the end of the war and during the end of the war, arrests, enforced disappearances, torture, rape, killings took place against really anyone part of that expensive broad definition, which at points in time really just amounted to being Tamil. And so again, coming back to this question of, well, how did this fear really embed itself within the communities? And how did communities sort of lose that intra-community trust and cohesiveness? Again, we have to turn back to the methods employed by the military during the last phase of the war. As Roger McGinty and others have studied, one of the strategies that the military used during the last phase of the conflict, post-2005, was something called social network analysis. And basically, social network analysis is a counterinsurgency strategy which involves mapping out social dynamics and relational links within a community, and then using the analysis to identify important nodes and hubs within the community that were viewed as targets. The destruction of those hubs or those nodes would mean destruction of the social network, which all analysts attributed as necessary to insurgency. And I think to drive that point home, between December 2005 and December 2007, as many in the room probably remember, human rights NGOs reported, and these were conservative estimates, that 1,500 people had been disappeared in that 2-year period alone when the ceasefire was breaking down. One of the primary ways in which the military identified people to disappear and identified people to target was through the defection of Karuna as well. And again, I think this is really important to understand because it comes back to how the Tamil community perceives others within the Tamil community. But following Karuna's defection from the LTT, the military made use of many of the cadres in Karuna's unit to point out other LTT cadres and to identify people who were influential and people who were important nodes within that network. And I think most recently this has been highlighted by a report that ITJP has put out on the Special Task Force, which again has testimony from Special Task Force officers referencing the use of Karuna's cadres. In addition, post-2009, a number of former LTT cadres who were surrendered or captured during that period were forced to point out other cadres and forced to point out other activists within the displacement camps, but also long after the war had ended. So one of the former cadres I've interviewed told me that he'd be asked to stand on the side of the road and nod if someone had walked by that was a former cadre in his village. And he was at such a loss as to what to do because he couldn't not do it because the military was threatening his family, but he also didn't want to point anyone out. So he just kind of randomly nodded. And so I think what's really important to understand from that is post-2009, the fear that took place and was rooted in communities wasn't just fear of the security forces, it became fear of your fellow villagers. Another example was last year, I'm sure some of you have read the Stories of Resilience project that we've been doing. Recently, we launched a series called Stories of Vahare, which are stories that have been taken largely from the Vahare region and parts of rural Batiklo. So last year we tried to set up an interview in a village in rural Batiklo, and it was through a university student who we are well acquainted with, and it was in his village. So he had gone and spoken to former cadre the day before and to arrange the interview and had confirmed everything. But the following day, the former cadre had received a phone call, that evening itself, the former cadre had received a phone call from CID asking, why are you speaking to this organization called Adeyalam? What do they want? What are you going to say? So we canceled the interview because we didn't want to put him at further risk. But the only people that had been in the room when he went to go speak to him was the university student, the former cadre, and then the former cadre's brother-in-law. And so kind of intelligence networks and the perception of distrust and fear comes down to even the familial level. And I think that these levels of suspicion and distrust are even further elevated in communities where the military has also pursued aggressive campaigns to employ former LTT cadres and Tamil women, because then they're subsequently perceived to be too close, to the military and working for the military. And I think a really good example of that is communities in which a large number of people are employed by the Ministry of Defense-run Civil Security Department. I keep coming back to the Civil Security Department because to me it's a symbol of what exactly we need to be concerned about in the long run when it comes to dampening the grassroots community's calls for Tamil national identity and self-determination. The CSD, for those who haven't read the report yet, was originally was the National Home Guard Service, which I'm sure many are familiar with. The National Home Guard Service themselves were complicit in many of the atrocity crimes that occurred during the war. And in fact, there was one National Home Guard person who was part of the Kumarapuram massacre, about which me and Mario wrote a report for Pearl on last year as well. So the Home Guard Service was turned into the CSD in 2006 by a gazette that was directed by then Secretary of Defense Gotabaya Rajapaksa. And up until 2009, the CSD was very much a counterinsurgency functioning unit. So it went into areas that had been where they had removed the LTT to make sure that there was no resurgence of the LTT and to make sure that people there didn't rise up again. And while many former LTT cadres and women didn't want to join the CSD at first when they came into their communities in 2012 and 2013, eventually many did, because the truth is there are very little economic opportunities available for them there. And the other reason some of them joined was they thought that already to their homes, the CID and security forces were visiting every day. So maybe if they joined, at least they could stop that. And I think the consequences of their joining, I won't go into too much detail, but I encourage you to read the report because it describes in detail how their engagement in civic and political affairs has been really repressed, and also how it's changed the way the communities perceive them and furthered distrust and suspicion within those communities. So I think what I've been discussing thus far really comes back to something that I think I have found really striking and to be true across the Northeast and almost all the communities I visited, with the exception maybe of Iranatipu, which is that intra-community cohesiveness and trust, particularly in areas where there is a heavy military presence and the military is particularly involved in civilian activities, has really broken down. And I think, one of the frameworks that's useful to use to analyze this is something called social capital, which is a sociological framework. And basically, social capital just refers to the features of communities and social organizations like trust, reciprocity, civic engagement that improve the efficiency of those societies and help facilitate coordinated activities. So what does if we accept that intra-community trust and cohesiveness has been negatively impacted by militarization, what does this mean in terms of the Tamil community's political and civic engagement, particularly on a framework which challenges the Sinhala state order and is premised on self-determination and nationhood? I think, again, these are just preliminary theoretical ideas that have come out of research I've done over the last 2 years. But one of the problems with this is when it comes to collective action, right? So problems with collective action occur when there is a difference between the benefit someone can gain from pursuing a course of action that's useful for themselves individually versus something that's useful for the collective. And applying this to the current context in the Northeast, many Tamil individuals are having to choose between working for the military or accepting other pacification measures by the Sri Lankan state, or continuing to support and espouse a Tamil national identity which challenges the Sri Lankan state and organizing and mobilizing for the latter. So as I think you've already heard from my colleague Guruparan, but he argues, and I agree, that the impression is being forcefully created that seeking self-determination is inimical to the very survival of the Tamil community. While on the other hand, the choice of foregoing the Tamil national identity in favor of support for the Sri Lankan state is perceived as providing short-term benefits to the individuals, as it ensures they're not seen as anti-state, not to mention the economic benefits that it can potentially provide to those individuals. So the question then becomes, does a reduction in the kind of social capital within Tamil communities, that cohesiveness, that trust, reduce their willingness to adopt the Tamil national identity and politics in favor of the Tamil national identity? Looking again at the CSD as a case study, there was one woman we interviewed in 2017, and when we originally interviewed her last year, she was able to be critical of the military. She was able to be critical still of Sinhala state parties, despite the fact that she was working for the CSD. Now, I've now interviewed her again about a year later, just under a year later. And in that time period, the military has only increased their involvement in her life. So now she is not only working for the CSD, but she is receiving specialized vocational training, which the CSD is offering everyone in the Kilinochchi and Mullaitivu areas now. And on top of that, she herself has been further isolated from her own community. So she no longer attends the church that she used to go to because others in the church were viewing her quite negatively because she had taken on this sort of specialized training, and they were seeing her as being even further embedded into the military. So when I interviewed her again this time, she could not, even though she did trust me and we had this relationship, she no longer could voice critique of the military. And she could also no longer really voice critique of the Sinhala state either, which I think is, and again, this hypothesis hasn't been tested quantitatively, and I don't want to make conclusions on this, but I think these are things that we need to be worried about and also further understand. Because what this means is in the future, Tamil nationalist political parties in the Northeast may have a harder time politically mobilizing, and it might become easier for some Sinhala state order aligned parties to make inroads. Some would argue, looking at the January 2018 elections, that some of that is already happening. One journalist basically did a chart analysis where he mapped Tamil nationalist parties, which he identified as the TNA, the TNPF, and the TULF, and how they had done at the 2018 local government elections versus how they had done at the 2015 general elections, and found that there was a 17% drop-off in the vote share that they had. Now, it's not a perfect comparison because it's a different set of elections with a different set of members, and people are much more willing to kind of take risks with voting in the local government elections and vote based on kind of personal affiliation as opposed to party affiliation. But then you look at something like the May Day rally that happened in Jaffna last week, where the JVP shows up. And granted, there's a lot of propaganda being spewed about how, the JVP, it was all locals who participated. They didn't bus anyone in, which I don't think is true. I've already heard reports of at least one bus having been brought in from outside. But nonetheless, they did manage to bring out a significant number of Tamil voters from that area. And so I think that, it is something that we need to be concerned about. But that being said, I also agree with Dr. Rasaratnam's view that Tamil national identity is the consequence of outcome of, I'm just going to say it in her words because she can say it much better than I can, but her quote is, the outcome of stepwise and temporally continuous processes of organization and mobilization that establish the idea of a Tamil national identity as a dominant and unavoidable presence in the Tamil political life. So basically, if we understand Tamil national identity as the outcome of political processes, as opposed to this primordial ethnic nationalism, I think we can better understand how Tamil nationalism can then be influenced by political processes, which makes it complex and multifaceted. Just because the Tamil community is losing intra-social capital doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to completely decimate Tamil national identity. But also as a result of Tamil national identity being the consequence of a political process, that process of reduction of trust can have an impact. I know I'm definitely running over time, so I'm just going to end by touching on a second intersecting piece of this analysis, which I think is also really important, which is what happens when the Tamil community becomes unable to identify oppressing structures as oppressive, or they internalize that oppression. Again, taking the CSD as an example, CSD employees no longer problematize the military's role in employing them. Some of them have even told reporters in Sri Lanka, quote, "We are working with trust, respect, and love with military officers and members of other communities under a zero-weapon concept." While some might recognize that their CSD is attempting to silence their voices, they've also become resigned to this fate. And there is limited dissent from within that population in the Vani to end the military's role in civilian activities. And so oppression by the state through militarization and securitization post-2009 in many ways has become the status quo in the Northeast. And its potential impact on Tamil political aspirations and engagement, while not definitive, should not be discounted. And I think when just to sort of summarize what I've said, the processes of militarization and securitization are creating in parallel mobilization of fear, reduction of kind of community social capital, and also the normalization or internalization of oppression. And now, again, I don't want to jump to conclusions. I'm not saying that because of this, there's going to be a drop-off in support for Tamil national identity in the future, but I do think that these processes are correlative and pose a risk to how we identify and how we sort of center Tamil political aspirations. But again, these are not fatalistic phenomenon, right? Like, I've had the privilege over the last year and a half of witnessing some of the most incredible, brave protest culture throughout the Northeast, whether on issues of families that have disappeared or on land. 2 weeks ago, I was with the community in Iranativu as they got on boats and took their land back from the Navy, which was the most incredible experience. And I think one of the things that really struck me about that community, and to me was one of the main reasons they were able to do that, is unity. That community was one of the most unified Tamil communities I have met in my time in Sri Lanka. And partly because though they live in Kilinochi and Edanamaru, like the military doesn't have a significant physical presence in their community. The Navy that occupies their land, it's an island, so it's off the coast, but actually in the coastland area where they live, the military doesn't have as significant of a presence as it does in other areas. And on top of that, the community is fairly homogenous, so they all belong to the same church, and that also contributes to part of the unity. But I think, I'll just end by saying that the one factor that I also haven't touched on that I think is important as well is the diaspora. So I know Dr. Sudhaharan Nadaraja has written a paper on this, and I think has spoken about this yesterday as well. The fact that, the diaspora is part of the Tamil nation and shouldn't be discounted as a stakeholder. And I think, Dr. Rasaratnam has made this point where Tamil nationalism really was kind of taken up by the diaspora post-2009, and how we frame it, how we continue to promote it or continue to use it as a framework is also very much centered right now in the diaspora. So the interactions between the diaspora and the homeland and the result of that, again, would need to be further studied. But I think as having lived here for the last 2 years, and seeing the impact that militarization and particularly securitization has had on communities' abilities to work together collectively, the breakdown in trust that's resulted, the impact that has not just on crimes committed by the security forces, but also on crimes committed within the community and the ability of communities to resolve those crimes, I think is particularly alarming. And I think it's definitely something that we all need to be taking seriously in our conversations about militarization, if we want to eventually ever get to a point where the Tamil community is free to determine their political aspirations and free to kind of develop a political framework that they want. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak. And I unfortunately can't stick around, but I'm happy to answer any questions by email.
From the ground. I think that very important point that Dharsha mentioned. One thing that how the Sri Lankan intelligence network strategically, internally and externally, dividing the Tamil community and destroying the Tamil community structurally, especially from the social aspect. So we always see from the wide aspect of the nation, but especially creating the fear among the Tamil community. What she mentioned in her words, like mobilization of fear through military surveillance. I think that's what the Sri Lankan military doing externally. And then internally, that they are creating a fear among us through how they create the mistrust among the community. That the example that she has given, especially we are in a place or in a room, a few people were there and they pass the information before they, Adayalam before they interview. I think that as long as a community itself, I think yesterday we have discussed about, one of the weakness in our side, our own denial about our past. Likewise, here, the creating a mistrust among community and destroying or dividing, coming together is a calculated, well-calculated strategy by the Sri Lankan state in order to stop or eliminate the existence of the Tamil nation. Thank you, Dharsha, once again. And so then we will, as Dharsha is, cannot continue to be with us today, but as she mentioned already that she's happy to answer any your questions or clarifications via email. So then we will go to the next speaker.
Thank you.